You know, Russia is suspending its participation in a key nuclear weapons agreement with the U.S. as the war in Ukraine rages on. During an address to Russia's National Assembly, President Vladimir Putin said he is suspending his country's involvement in the new START treaty, although he stopped short of completely withdrawing from the pact. The treaty puts limits on the number of nuclear weapons that both the U.S. and Russia can have and allows the countries to inspect each other's arsenals. He said Russia must stand ready to resume nuclear weapons tests if the U.S. does so, and accused the West of fueling the war in Ukraine. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, called the move deeply unfortunate and irresponsible. CTV's reporter Paul Workman spoke on Putin's remarks today.
Well, I think the sort of ultimate message from Putin was this war is going to go on for quite a while, Russians, and you better get used to it. Again, some familiar themes that he would use all the means at his disposal to protect the motherland, to protect Russia, blaming Ukraine, saying that Russia didn't start this war. He was merely defending territory and protecting the people of his own country, and that it was really the Ukrainians who were to blame for it, backed, of course, by the United States. That's always a part of his themes. He said or accused the West of turning what he called a local conflict into a global conflict. That seemed to be another theme of his message today. And as you mentioned, the nuclear arms treaty, the United States says the Russians weren't complying with the treaty anyway, and that they had signaled quite some time ago that they wouldn't be entering negotiations. And very carefully, I think it's true that Putin said today he is suspending talks on the START treaty, but not getting out of the talks permanently.
So we're just days away from the first anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. What's the feeling there on the ground? And we've heard so much, Paul, about the spring offensive by the Russians. What can you tell us about the fighting as well in terms of what's happening on the ground?
Sure. Well, let's go back to a year ago when this city essentially cleared out. People left to the western part of Ukraine because it was much safer there. The trains took millions of people to the frontiers, to places where they could live safely with their families. Well, many people have come back. Kyiv is operating almost as normal today. I spoke with a cafe owner this morning who left. He got in his car a year ago and got out of town, and then a few months later he decided he had to come back. And he's reopened his cafe, and he says he's no longer afraid of what Vladimir Putin might do. In terms of the spring offensive, most security analysts, military analysts, believe that the Russians have started their offensive, started a few weeks ago on the eastern side of the country in the Donbass region, and that's where they're trying to concentrate on breaking through Ukrainian defensive lines. It's suggested here that Ukraine is more likely to open its spring offensive once it gets those tanks coming in from other Western nations in the southern part of the country, trying to break through Russian lines there. I think that's what we have to look forward to in not just the weeks, but the months ahead.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky is thanking the U.S. for rallying international support for his country in its fight against Russia. In a tweet following President Biden's speech on the conflict from Poland, Zelensky repeated Biden's remarks that the capital city of Kyiv stands strong and free nearly a year into the invasion. He said Ukraine and its allies are headed toward a common victory that must occur this year. His comments came after Biden made a surprise visit to Kyiv. President Biden made remarks in Poland today about that visit.
You know, it was nearly 1 year ago. Nearly 1 year ago, I spoke at the Royal Castle here in Warsaw, just weeks after Vladimir Putin had unleashed his murderous assault on Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since World War II had begun. And the principles that have been the cornerstone of peace, prosperity, and stability on this planet for more than 75 years were at risk of being shattered. 1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud. It stands tall. And most important, it stands free. When Russia invaded, It wasn't just Ukraine being tested. The whole world faced a test for the ages. Europe was being tested. America was being tested. NATO was being tested. All democracies were being tested. And the questions we faced were as simple as they were profound. Would we respond? Or would we look the other way? Would we be strong? Or would we be weak? Would we, all of our allies, would be united or divided? 1 year later, we know the answer. We did respond. We would be strong. We would be united. And the world would not look the other way. We also face fundamental questions about the commitment to the most basic of principles. Would we stand up for the sovereignty of nations? Would we stand up for the right of people to live free from naked aggression? Would we stand up for democracy? 1 year later, we know the answers. Yes, we would stand up for sovereignty, and we did. Yes, we would stand up for the right of people to live free from aggression, and we did. And we would stand up for democracy, and we did. And yesterday, I had the honor to stand with President Zelensky in Kyiv to declare that we will keep standing up for these same things, no matter what. When President Putin ordered his tanks to roll into Ukraine, he thought we would roll over. He was wrong. The Ukrainian people are too brave. America, Europe, a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we were too unified. Democracy was too strong. Instead of an easy victory he perceived and predicted, Putin left with burnout tanks and Russia's forces in disarray. He thought he'd get the Finlandization of NATO. Instead, he got the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. He thought NATO would fracture and divide. Instead, NATO is more united and more unified than ever before. He thought he could weaponize energy to crack your resolve, Europe's resolve. Instead, we're working together to end Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. He thought autocrats like himself were tough and leaders of democracy were soft. And then he met the iron will of America and the nations everywhere that refused to accept the world governed by fear and force. He found himself at war with a nation led by a man whose courage would be forged in fire and steel, President Zelensky. President Putin is confronted with something today that he didn't think was possible a year ago. The democracies of the world have grown stronger, not weaker. But the autocrats of the world have grown weaker, not stronger. Because in the moments of great upheaval and uncertainty, that knowing what you stand for is most important. And knowing who stands with you makes all the difference. The people of Poland know that. You know that. In fact, you know it better than anyone here in Poland. Because that's what solidarity means. Through partition and oppression, when the beautiful city was destroyed after the Warsaw Uprising, during decades under the iron fist of communist rule, Poland endured because you stood together. That's how brave leaders of the opposition and the people of Belarus continue to fight for their democracy. That's how the resolve of Moldovan people, the resolve of the people of Moldova to live in freedom, when it gained them independence and put them on the path to EU membership. President Sandu is here today. I'm not sure she is, but I'm proud to stand with you and the freedom-loving people of Moldova. Give her a round of applause. 1 year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power. He doubts our continued support for Ukraine. He doubts whether NATO can remain unified. But there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire. President Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail, and the Ukrainian people's love for their country will prevail. remain guard over freedom today, tomorrow, and forever. So that's what's at stake here. Freedom. That's the message I carried to Kyiv yesterday, directly to the people of Ukraine. When President Zelensky said he came to the United States in December, quote, he said, this struggle will define the world and what our children and grandchildren, how they live, and then their children and grandchildren. He wasn't only speaking about the children and grandchildren of Ukraine. He was speaking about all of our children and grandchildren, yours and mine. We're seeing again today what the people of Poland and the people across Europe saw for decades. Appetites of the autocrat cannot be appeased. They must be opposed. Autocrats only understand one word: no, no, no. No, you will not take my country. No, you will not take my freedom. No, you will not take my future. And I'll repeat tonight what I said last year in the same place. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
That's President Joe Biden speaking in Poland today after a surprise visit to Ukraine yesterday.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Mark.
So I don't know where to start. Should we start on the visit to Kyiv by the president? And I guess that's immediately followed up some of the things that Putin said today. He's not backing down. He says, we're not fighting the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people have become hostages of the Kyiv regime and its Western masters, which have effectively occupied the country. Reaction to that?
Well, my reaction to his, again, once rescheduled, delayed speech, which was curiously staged to happen when it did in order to upstage our president. And it really contained nothing of new. It's just regurgitation of the same old talking points that they've had for a year now. The fact that they have, quote unquote, suspended their participation in START treaty just kind of shows us that they're out of options, because this treaty has been in one form or another of suspension since COVID-19, and it pretty much just contains that we get to inspect each other's nuclear facilities and, moratorium on production of the same. But what does that mean? That, if they're going to produce more nuclear weapons, we'll be able to blow up our entire planet 10 times over versus 5 times over? I'm not sure that's going to make a whole lot of difference. All it shows is that Russians are simply out of options.
So here we are. I mean, it is really, you and I have been talking about this for almost a year now, because it's Friday, where it's the year anniversary of the invasion. And I think I remember even a couple of months in, Amir, I said that, it looked like it was going to be a long slog. For those of us who are following from afar, this thing is still very, very confusing. And I don't know that we have a good grasp on what the current situation is with the state of what's happening on the ground in the warfare. I mean, is there a way to gauge that?
So currently, the state of the war is pretty much, I would say, stalemate, because Russians are fighting for every square foot at a very heavy toll in personnel and equipment. We've just seen what's happened around small city of Bakhmut, where Russians are throwing virtually everything at it for some type of a symbolic victory, because they've already invested so much. And it's like the sunk cost theory. Ukrainians are not giving up, but it seems like Ukrainians are probably going to have to give up that city in order to trade space for time. Ukraine. I was wrong last year when I predicted that Ukrainians could be done by the end of the year. However, what I didn't take into consideration, I suppose I was looking at it through rosy glasses, that Western allies are going to provide Ukraine with all of the firepower they need in a timely manner. That did not happen. Ukrainians have started running a little low on ammo, just as apparently Russians are. And, on Putin's commentary of hostages, well, I don't know if Ukrainian people are how are Ukrainian people hostages when they're the ones getting murdered and killed with numerous rocket attacks, missile attacks by Russian military in civilian cities. So, Russians are just left with continuation of terrorism in order to make Ukrainians submit to Russian willpower. But I think Ukrainians are fighting hard. They're fighting courageously. And I don't think that's going to happen. So my new prediction is this is going to go on for another couple of years.
It seems that way. Now it seems to make sense that it's going to last. Now we also have, did I hear in that speech from Putin, because, and this is where I don't know how this administration can't get more forceful on this topic, but China is making it even more clear whose side they're on in this. So what do you do with that diplomatically working forward? Because it's getting more complicated from that standpoint, isn't it, from the diplomatic standpoint?
Certainly. It's going to take utilization of all of our elements and instruments of national power, whether it's diplomatic, military, informational, economic. We're going to have to employ all of our instruments of power and also keep our allies to go along with us in order to counter this. Certainly what it appears is that it has all the markings of new Cold War. But some people suspect that Russia may side with China, but they have so much of their own history that I don't really think that China and Russia are going to embrace each other as we may suspect. China also has to contend with the fact that they are dependent on us buying cheap goods from there. And although industrialization is coming back to our country, China is still heavily dependent on not just us, but also European Union, which made its stance pretty clear. And although they may not be contributing monetarily, militarily as much as we are, they are still heavily invested in keeping Russia in Russia, not in Ukraine, Poland, and other nations that Russians have designs against.
But if this goes on for another couple of years, which I don't know how at this point you can think that it won't, where does that leave Ukraine as a nation in the end anyway? Or is that what Putin wants?
I think that depends on us. I think at this point, Putin maybe can, because it is crystal clear that Russians will never be able to occupy and annex whole of Ukraine. They will never be able to control that country. I mean, we, the United States, were unable to take control of Iraq and Afghanistan fully, right? And we all know how that ended up happening. But Putin with his 140 million people is trying to control a neighboring country of 40 million people. I mean, they will be stuck in such Ukrainian mud, if you don't mind me saying that, for decades. Is going to bleed Russia dry. So what I think they'll have to do is achieve their strategic objectives of keeping Ukraine away from EU and NATO by keeping them a failed state. So they don't need to take hold of Ukraine. All they have to do is sabotage Ukraine economically and diplomatically to the point where it becomes a failed state and cause Ukrainian population to seek a better life elsewhere. And that's something that will be strategic failure on our part, and we must do whatever we can not to allow Russians to achieve that.
Okay, but along those lines here, look, I think there's some legitimate questions to be asked and hopefully answered about return on investment here. I know these are big, giant geopolitical issues that have a lot of consequences, and a little radio guy here in St. Louis does not have the brain capacity to break all of these things down. On the other hand, we got issues here, and here's Ron DeSantis talking about some of this because the blank check policy doesn't really work for me or for him.
Well, they have effectively a blank check policy with no clear strategic objective identified. And these things can escalate, and I don't think it's in our interest to be getting into proxy war with China getting involved over things like the borderlands or over Crimea. So I think it would behoove them to identify what is the strategic objective that they're trying to achieve. But just saying it's an open-ended blank check, that is not acceptable.
Amir, how do you react to those comments? Because I tend to agree with Governor DeSantis on that.
And I do agree with Governor DeSantis on his point of no clear strategic objective being identified. That's something that not just our administration, but NATO alliance needs to clarify, because I really don't know what our clear strategic objective is at this point. Is it regime change in Moscow? Is it sending Russians back to the 2014 borders or 2008 borders? We just don't know what we're doing. However, this blank check, as described, I think that's a little bit of a political posturing, because if Ukraine if Ukraine succeeds in its defense, that's going to make President Biden look really good, despite all of his shortfalls. And I think that there is small number of Republicans that are posturing by kind of sort of, hey, whatever Biden is doing, we're going to do the opposite. And I'm not sure that that's a clear strategic objective politically for them, because it's causing confusion amongst the electorate. It's causing confusion in the United States, because I have a number of friends who I respect tremendously who are saying, hey, that's none of our business what happens over there in Ukraine and Russia. And I